First Ukraine, now Zambia. Behind the headlines, a quiet storm is brewing in southern Africa. US generals, Chinese banks, African revolutionaries, and exiled first ladies, all tangled in a silent war over Africa's future. What does Esther Lungu have to do with it? Why is Ibrahim Traoré being watched? And could Zambia become the next global hotspot? Could Zambia be the next geopolitical battlefield? As the United States and China silently compete for influence in Africa, Zambia finds itself at the center of a brewing global storm. In this investigative documentary, we uncover the shocking truth behind Zambia's rising importance, from secret IMF deals to the presence of US General Langley, Chinese strategic investments, and Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré's unexpected influence. Former First Lady Esther Lungu's reappearance only deepens the mystery. Is Zambia becoming the next Ukraine, not in war, but in influence and control? Don't miss this explosive breakdown of what's really happening behind closed doors. Subscribe to InspirAfrica Official for more truth behind African politics and global power plays. Intro: Why Zambia matters now. Zambia's significance in 2025 is multifaceted, rooted in its strategic resources, geographic position, and role as a bellwether for African development. As Africa's second-largest copper producer, Zambia accounts for about 70% of its export earnings from copper, a critical mineral for the global energy transition, powering electric vehicles, wind turbines, and electronics. With global copper demand projected to rise 20% by 2030, Zambia's Copperbelt province is a focal point for major powers like the US, China, and the EU, seeking secure supply chains. Zambia's landlocked position, bordering 8 countries, DRC, Tanzania, Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, Angola, makes it a linchpin for regional trade, notably through the Lobito Corridor, a US-backed rail project connecting Zambia's mines to Angola's Atlantic ports. Economically, Zambia faces severe challenges. Over 58% of its 19.5 million people live below the international poverty line, and its 2020 debt default, the first in Africa during the COVID-19 era, exposed vulnerabilities in its copper-dependent economy. Total public debt reached $34 billion in 2021, 133% of GDP, with $16.8 billion in foreign holdings, including $6 billion owed to China. The 2024 drought, declared a national disaster, and environmental crises like the Kafue River acid spill from a Chinese-owned mine have intensified economic and social pressures, highlighting the tension between resource exploitation and sustainability. Chatham House. Or politically, Zambia's stability since independence in 1964, with 9 peaceful presidential elections, contrasts with regional volatility. However, the death of former President Edgar Lungu in June 2025 and the upcoming 2026 elections raise concerns about political polarization. President Hakainde Hichilema's pro-Western shift and efforts to triple copper production signal ambition, but also dependence on foreign investment, making Zambia a microcosm of Africa's struggle for sovereignty amid global power competition. Zambia matters because it embodies the challenges of resource-rich nations navigating debt, foreign influence, and democratic governance in a multipolar world. BBC.com. The Ukraine analogy: hype or real threat? The analogy comparing Zambia to Ukraine suggests fears that Zambia could become a proxy battleground for great power rivalry, similar to Ukraine's role in US-Russia tensions. The comparison draws on Zambia's strategic resources and its entanglement with competing powers, China, the US, and, to a lesser extent, Russia. However, the analogy is both compelling and overstated, requiring careful unpacking. Similarities: like Ukraine, Zambia is resource-rich and geopolitically significant. Copper and cobalt are analogous to Ukraine's grain and gas pipelines, critical to global markets. China's $6 billion debt hold and control over mining assets mirror Russia's economic leverage over Ukraine pre-2014. The US's $4 billion Lobito Corridor investment, aimed at countering China, echoes NATO's eastward expansion as a Western counterweight. Zambia's vote against Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the UN in 2022, unlike its neighbors' abstentions, signals a pro-Western tilt under Hichilema, potentially antagonizing other powers. EurasiaReview.com. ChathamHouse.org. Differences: the scale and nature of the threats diverge sharply. Ukraine faces direct military aggression, whereas Zambia's challenges are economic and diplomatic. Zambia's debt crisis, exacerbated by a $42.5 million Eurobond default in 2020, reflects financial overextension rather than territorial conflict. While Ukraine's crisis involves NATO and Russian military posturing, Zambia's risks stem from debt dependency and resource competition. The US has no significant military presence in Zambia, and China's influence is economic, not militarized. Allegations of US funding for Zambia's security sector, raised by Zimbabwe's President Mnangagwa, lack evidence and may reflect regional rivalries rather than reality. Reuters. EurasiaReview.com. Critical analysis: the debt trap diplomacy narrative, often applied to China's loans, is oversimplified. Zambia's debt crisis results from both Chinese lending and Western Eurobonds, compounded by domestic mismanagement under Edgar Lungu, who borrowed heavily for infrastructure to secure votes. The Ukraine analogy amplifies fears of conflict, but distracts from Zambia's real threat: economic subjugation. If Zambia fails to renegotiate debt terms or regulate foreign mining, it risks losing control over its resources, akin to a soft colonization. The analogy is hype unless geopolitical tensions escalate into proxy conflicts, which current evidence does not support. Harvard.edu. U.S. military interests and General Langley's involvement. U.S. military interests in Zambia align with its broader strategy to counter China and secure critical minerals. General Michael E. Langley, commander of U.S. Africa Command (AFRICOM), oversees security cooperation in Africa, but specific details of his involvement in Zambia are not explicitly documented in the provided sources. AFRICOM's mission includes counterterrorism, capacity building, and protecting U.S. economic interests, which in Zambia likely focus on securing the Copperbelt and supporting the Lobito Corridor. ChathamHouse.org. Context: the U.S. has historically used military aid to bolster influence in Africa, often under the guise of counterterrorism. Zambia, with no significant terrorist threat, is more likely a target for economic security operations. The Lobito Corridor, funded by the U.S., EU, and African Development Bank, aims to transport copper to Western markets, reducing reliance on Chinese-controlled routes. Military cooperation could involve training Zambia's defense forces to secure mining infrastructure or intelligence sharing to monitor Chinese activities. Allegations of U.S. funding for Zambia's security sector, raised by Zimbabwe, suggest tensions over Western influence but lack substantiation. EurasiaReview.com. Critical perspective: the U.S. narrative of promoting stability often masks resource-driven motives. Copper's role in the green energy transition makes Zambia a priority, but military engagement risks entangling it in superpower rivalries. Zambia's non-aligned tradition, rooted in its Cold War stance, suggests caution against over-reliance on the U.S. Langley's involvement, if any, would likely be diplomatic, coordinating with Hichilema's government to align security and economic goals. However, increased U.S. presence could provoke local backlash, as seen in 2019 when U.S. Ambassador Daniel Foot's criticism of Zambia's anti-LGBTQ laws led to his recall after Lungu declared him persona non grata. Zambia must balance U.S. support with sovereignty to avoid becoming a pawn in global competition. Wikipedia.org. China's billion-dollar grip on Zambia. China's influence in Zambia is profound, driven by its role as the largest bilateral creditor, holding about $6 billion of Zambia's $16.8 billion foreign debt. Through the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), China has funded infrastructure like the Tazara Railway, airports, and dams, but these projects have fueled a debt crisis. Zambia's 2020 default on a $42.5 million Eurobond payment, the first African default during the pandemic, was exacerbated by Chinese loans, sparking accusations of debt trap diplomacy. InspirAfrica.org. Reuters.com. Historical context: China-Zambia relations date to the 1960s, with the Tazara Railway symbolizing anti-colonial solidarity. Under Edgar Lungu, 2015 to 2021, borrowing surged, including a $287 billion loan for the Link Zambia 8000 road project, driven by electoral incentives and public demand for infrastructure. Chinese firms dominate mining, controlling 69% of Zambia's construction sector, but incidents like the 2024 Kafue River acid spill have fueled anti-Chinese sentiment. Harvard.edu. Here, Harvard.edu. Current dynamics: Hichilema's administration has sought to reduce Chinese debt, canceling $1.6 billion in undisbursed loans and passing the Public Debt Management Bill to cap borrowing at 65% of GDP. Yet, Hichilema's goal to triple copper production relies on Chinese investment, creating a paradox. China's loans, while significant, are not the sole driver of Zambia's debt. Eurobonds, $3 billion, and multilateral lenders also contribute. The debt trap narrative is debated. Some argue China exploits African nations, while others, like the China-Africa Research Initiative, note that poor debt management by both parties is a key factor. USvsChina or Chatham House or TandFonline.com. Implications: China's grip risks entrenching dependency, but Zambia's agency is critical. New debt laws and negotiations under the G20 Common Framework show progress, but Chinese leverage remains. Zambia must diversify its economy and strengthen regulatory oversight to mitigate environmental and economic risks from Chinese investments. The return of Esther Lungu: coincidence or strategy? Esther Lungu's re-emergence in Zambia's political sphere following Edgar Lungu's death in June 2025 has sparked speculation about her intentions. As the widow of a polarizing president, her return could be a strategic move to leverage Lungu's legacy within the Patriotic Front (PF), or a personal response to her husband's passing. BBC.com. Background: Edgar Lungu's tenure, 2015 to 2021, was marked by infrastructure development, but also corruption scandals and economic mismanagement, culminating in Zambia's 2020 debt default. His death left the PF leaderless, and the Constitutional Court's December 2024 ruling barring him from running in 2026 before his death weakened the party. Esther, though not a prominent political figure, carries symbolic weight as Lungu's widow. Faso. Her daughter, Tasila Lungu, a PFMP, announced his death, suggesting the family's ongoing influence. Reuters, combc.com. Possible strategy. Esther's return could be a calculated effort to unify the PF, which faces internal divisions and a strong challenge from Hichilema's United Party for National Development (UPND). Lungu's base, particularly in urban and copperbelt areas, remains loyal, and Esther could galvanize supporters by invoking "One Zambia, One Nation," a slogan tied to Lungu's legacy. Her visibility might counter Hichilema's narrative of a new dawn government, especially amid economic challenges like inflation, 15% in 2024, and drought-related food insecurity. BBC.com Library MF.org. Challenges. Esther faces legal and political hurdles. Lungu's allies, including his economic advisor, have been arrested for corruption, and Esther herself may face scrutiny. The PF's history of thuggery under Lungu could taint her image, and her lack of political experience may limit her effectiveness. If her return is coincidental, driven by personal grief or family obligations, it risks being exploited by PF factions seeking a figurehead. BBC.com Reuters.com. Analysis. Esther's re-emergence is likely a mix of strategy and circumstance. The PF's need for a unifying figure ahead of 2026 makes her a potential asset, but her ability to lead depends on navigating Zambia's polarized politics and legal challenges. Her role may remain symbolic, rallying Lungu's base without directly challenging Hichilema. Enter Ibrahim Traoré, Africa's rising revolutionary. Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's 37-year-old military leader, has emerged as a Pan-African icon since his 2022 coup, advocating for sovereignty and resource nationalization. His relevance to Zambia lies in his influence as a symbol of resistance to foreign domination, resonating with Zambia's struggles against Chinese debt and Western mining companies. Traoré's influence, Traoré's policies, nationalizing mines, expelling French troops, and rejecting IMF aid, appeal to Africans frustrated by neo-colonialism. In Zambia, where 89.2% of exports are raw materials, mostly copper, Traoré's call for resource control could inspire activism, particularly among youth facing unemployment and poverty, 60% poverty rate. His anti-Western rhetoric contrasts with Hichilema's pro-Western stance, potentially fueling opposition narratives. Geopolitics, edu chathamhouse.org. Relevance to Zambia. Zambia's reliance on foreign miners like Glencore and First Quantum, which evade taxes through capital flight, $5 billion in 2021, mirrors Burkina Faso's pre-coup exploitation. Traoré's model of nationalization could appeal to Zambians critical of Hichilema's privatization policies. However, Zambia's stable democracy and non-aligned tradition make a coup unlikely. Traoré's influence is more likely to manifest in grassroots movements or PF rhetoric accusing Hichilema of selling out to foreign interests. Geopolitics.georgetown.edu. Critical perspective. Traoré's approach, while inspiring, carries risks. Burkina Faso's economic isolation and security challenges highlight the limits of radical policies. Zambia, dependent on copper exports and IMF loans, $1.3 billion extended credit facility, cannot afford to alienate global partners. Traoré's symbolic role may pressure Hichilema to renegotiate mining contracts, but Zambia's economic realities limit revolutionary options. HR.org. IMF, debt traps, and resource control. Zambia's relationship with the IMF and its debt crisis are central to its economic challenges. In 2022, the IMF approved a $1.3 billion extended credit facility (ECF) to address the 2020 default, conditioned on austerity measures like cutting fuel and electricity subsidies and raising taxes. These reforms reduced inflation from 24.4% in 2021 to 9.4% in 2023, but increased living costs, exacerbating poverty over 60%. Georgetown.edu. Debt dynamics. Zambia's $34 billion debt in 2021 included $16.8 billion in foreign holdings, with China $6 billion and Eurobond holders $3 billion as major creditors. The IMF's focus on fiscal consolidation ignores structural issues. Zambia's copper-dependent economy, 89.2% of exports, is vulnerable to price fluctuations, a legacy of colonial extractive policies. Multinationals exploit tax loopholes, draining billions, while IMF conditions limit domestic debt restructuring, prioritizing foreign creditors. Chatham House, or Georgetown, edu Georgetown.edu. Debt trap debate. The debt trap narrative often targets China, but Zambia's crisis stems from both Chinese loans and Western financial instruments. Lungu's secretive borrowing and mismanagement amplified the problem. The G20 Common Framework has facilitated restructuring, but delays, criticized by UN experts, hinder economic recovery. HI at Harvard USvsChina.org. Resource control. Zambia's copper wealth enriches foreign firms, not locals. The IMF's neoliberal policies, like promoting public-private partnerships, fail to address this, potentially worsening inequality. Zambia needs stronger tax enforcement and value-added industries to retain mineral wealth. Georgetown.edu. IMF, debt traps, and resource control. Zambia's relationship with the IMF and its debt crisis are central to its economic challenges. In 2022, the IMF approved a $1.3 billion extended credit facility (ECF) to address the 2020 default, conditioned on austerity measures like cutting fuel and electricity subsidies and raising taxes. These reforms reduced inflation from 24.4% in 2021 to 9.4% in 2023, but increased living costs, exacerbating poverty over 60%. Georgetown, edu. Debt dynamics. Zambia's $34 billion debt in 2021 included $16.8 billion in foreign holdings, with China $6 billion and Eurobond holders $3 billion as major creditors. The IMF's focus on fiscal consolidation ignores structural issues. Zambia's copper-dependent economy, 89.2% of exports, is vulnerable to price fluctuations, a legacy of colonial extractive policies. Multinationals exploit tax loopholes, draining billions, while IMF conditions limit domestic debt restructuring, prioritizing foreign creditors. Chatham House or Georgetown, edu. Georgetown, edu. Debt trap debate. The debt trap narrative often targets China, but Zambia's crisis stems from both Chinese loans and Western financial instruments. Lungu's secretive borrowing and mismanagement amplified the problem. The G20 Common Framework has facilitated restructuring, but delays, criticized by UN experts, hinder economic recovery. Art Harvard edu. USvsChina. Resource control. Zambia's copper wealth enriches foreign firms, not locals. The IMF's neoliberal policies, like promoting public-private partnerships, fail to address this, potentially worsening inequality. Zambia needs stronger tax enforcement and value-added industries to retain mineral wealth. Georgetown, edu. What the African Union isn't saying. The African Union, AU, has been notably silent on Zambia's debt and geopolitical challenges, reflecting its limited influence and dependence on external funding. The AU's push for G20 inclusion aims to amplify Africa's voice, but it avoids confronting major creditors like China, which holds leverage due to historical ties and loans. ChathamHouse.org. Context. Zambia's debt restructuring under the G20 Common Framework bypasses the AU, involving bilateral talks with China, India, and Western creditors. The AU's silence may stem from its fragmented structure and reliance on foreign donors, who provide 60% of its budget. Criticizing China or the IMF risks alienating key partners. The AU's failure to advocate for Zambia reinforces perceptions of it as a weak institution, unable to counter neo-colonial influences. Reuters.com. Implications. The AU's inaction leaves Zambia to navigate global pressures alone, highlighting the gap between its Pan-African rhetoric and practical impact. A stronger AU could push for collective debt relief or mining reforms, but internal divisions and external dependencies limit its role. Is Zambia the next battlefield? Zambia is unlikely to face military conflict, but is a battleground for economic and geopolitical influence. The US-China rivalry over copper, environmental crises like the Kafue River spill, and political tensions ahead of 2026 elections create a volatile mix. Hichilema's pro-Western policies and China's economic leverage could polarize domestic politics, with the PF exploiting anti-foreign sentiment. Zambia's challenge is to balance foreign investment with sovereignty, avoiding economic colonization. ChathamHouse.org. Final thoughts. The future of Africa's sovereignty. Zambia's trajectory reflects Africa's broader struggle for sovereignty. Its copper wealth, debt crisis, and foreign entanglements highlight the need for economic diversification, stronger governance, and regional unity. Progress like debt restructuring and new laws is promising, but without addressing structural issues, tax evasion, resource exploitation, and IMF dependency, Zambia risks perpetual vulnerability. The AU's weakness and figures like Traore underscore the urgency of African-led solutions to reclaim control over resources and destiny.